Number 1. Richard Speck, a maritime worker whose rampage inside a townhouse became one of America's most infamous mass murders. On the evening of July 13, 1966, Richard Franklin Speck, a 24-year-old drifter from rural Illinois, forced his way into a townhouse on East 100th Street in Chicago, a quiet residential neighborhood near the Jeffrey Elementary School and South Chicago Community Hospital. The townhouse served as a dormitory for student nurses who were completing their training at the hospital, young women in their early 20s who had come to Chicago from small towns across the Midwest with the hope of building careers in medicine. Speck had spent the prior hours drinking heavily at several bars in the area, fueled by a volatile mixture of alcohol, amphetamines, and a deep-seated rage that had been building for years, rooted in a chaotic childhood marked by severe physical abuse, the tragic death of his father in a tractor accident when Speck was only 6 years old, and a string of petty criminal offenses that had already resulted in stints in local jails. Just days before the murders, Speck had stabbed a man in a violent altercation and was hiding from the authorities, drifting through the streets of Chicago with no clear plan other than evasion and survival. The townhouse, which was home to 9 young women, was chosen almost at random after Speck had spotted one of the nurses, Corazon Amureo, through a window as he walked along the street. He initially knocked on the door under the pretense of needing a drink of water, but once the door was opened, he produced a knife and a handgun, immediately establishing a terrifying dominance over the occupants. Over the course of the next several hours, Speck methodically terrorized the women, binding them with strips of bed sheets he tore from the beds, gagging them with their own clothing, and systematically separating them one by one into adjacent rooms where he sexually assaulted and strangled or stabbed them to death. The victims were Gloria Davy, Patricia Matusek, Nina Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Suzanne Ferris, Mary Ann Jordan, Merlita Gargullo, and Valentina Passion, each of whom died alone in a dark room while the others listened to the muffled sounds of their suffering, paralyzed by fear and the knowledge that any resistance would result in immediate death. Corazon Amureo, the sole survivor, managed to evade Speck by hiding beneath a bunk bed in a small bedroom, squeezing herself into a space so tight that Speck, who searched the townhouse multiple times in a state of intoxicated frenzy, overlooked her entirely. After Speck finally left the townhouse in the early morning hours of July 14, Amureo remained hidden for several more hours before climbing out of a second-story window onto a ledge and screaming for help, drawing the attention of neighbors who called the Chicago Police Department. When officers arrived and entered the townhouse, they discovered a scene of almost incomprehensible horror, with the bodies of 8 young women arranged in various rooms throughout the small residence, each bearing the brutal marks of asphyxiation and stabbing. The investigation was immediately designated as the highest priority within the Chicago Police Department, with Chief of Detectives William Frost assigning dozens of detectives to the case around the clock. The breakthrough came when a massive manhunt across the city led to the identification of Speck through a fingerprint match at the scene, connecting him to the prior stabbing incident that had already placed him on the radar of local law enforcement. Speck was actually located on July 17, 1966, not through detective work in the traditional sense, but because a local resident named William Doreen recognized a newspaper composite sketch and called police to report that a man matching the description was staying at a transient hotel called the Starlight on West Madison Street. When officers arrived at the hotel, Speck attempted to flee by jumping from a second-story window but was pursued down an alley and apprehended after a brief but violent struggle. During his trial, which began on April 3, 1967, in the Cook County Criminal Court, the prosecution, led by State's Attorney William Martin, presented a devastating case built on forensic evidence, eyewitness identification, and the powerful testimony of Corazon Amureo, who sat directly across the courtroom from Speck and identified him without hesitation as the man who had murdered her friends. The defense, led by Public Defender Gerald Getty, attempted to argue that Speck was legally insane at the time of the crimes, presenting testimony from psychiatrists who described Speck as suffering from a personality disorder characterized by explosive rage and an inability to control his impulses. However, the prosecution countered with their own psychiatric experts who testified that while Speck clearly suffered from a personality disorder, he knew the difference between right and wrong and had demonstrated clear premeditation in his actions, including the methodical way he had bound the victims and the deliberate choices he made to separate and kill them one at a time. On April 15, 1967, after less than 50 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Richard Speck guilty of the murders of all 8 nurses. The judge, Herbert C. Passion, sentenced Speck to death by electric chair, a sentence that would later be commuted to 8 consecutive terms of 100 to 150 years in 1972 when the United States Supreme Court struck down existing death penalty statutes in the landmark case Furman v. Georgia. Speck was subsequently transferred to the Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet, Illinois, where he lived for the remainder of his life, an existence that became almost as notorious as his crimes when a clandestine video recording surfaced in 1996 showing Speck inside the prison, seemingly living a comfortable life among other inmates, using illegal drugs, and displaying what appeared to be hormone-enhanced breasts from smuggled estrogen treatments. The video sparked widespread outrage across Illinois and the nation, raising serious questions about the conditions inside the state's correctional facilities and the adequacy of security measures for one of the country's most notorious mass murderers. Richard Speck died of a heart attack on December 5, 1991, at the age of 49, taking to his grave any comprehensive explanation for why he committed the crimes that defined his existence. For the families of the victims, the decades between the murders and Speck's death were filled with a painful mixture of grief, anger, and the exhausting burden of repeated parole hearings where they were forced to relive the nightmare in order to ensure that Speck would never walk free. The community of Chicago, and in particular the medical community connected to South Chicago Community Hospital, was profoundly and permanently affected by the murders, with the townhouse on East 100th Street becoming a site of morbid pilgrimage and a permanent reminder that violence could penetrate even the most seemingly safe and ordinary environments. Corazon Amureo, the woman whose courage and composure under unimaginable pressure provided the critical testimony that sealed Speck's conviction, returned to the Philippines and largely avoided public attention for the rest of her life, carrying with her the invisible scars of a night that no human being should ever have to endure. The case of Richard Speck also had a lasting impact on criminal justice practices in Illinois and beyond, prompting changes in the way student housing was secured, influencing the development of more rigorous background check protocols for individuals working near or having access to medical facilities, and contributing to the broader national conversation about the death penalty, mental health, and the capacity of the criminal justice system to adequately respond to acts of extreme mass violence. Number 2, David Parker Ray, a mechanic who constructed a soundproof torture trailer in the remote desert of New Mexico and inflicted unimaginable suffering on his victims. For decades, the small town of Elephant Butte, nestled along the shores of a reservoir in Sierra County, New Mexico, was known primarily as a quiet destination for fishermen, retirees, and boaters seeking escape from the bustle of city life, a place where neighbors left their doors unlocked and the vast desert landscape provided a sense of peaceful isolation rather than danger. David Parker Ray, known locally as a quiet and somewhat reclusive man who worked as an auto mechanic, lived in a modest mobile home on a parcel of land that backed up to the desert, and to the casual observer, he seemed unremarkable, a middle-aged man who kept to himself, occasionally helped out at a local church, and spent his free time tinkering with cars and riding his motorcycle. Beneath this carefully constructed veneer of normalcy, however, Ray had spent years building what he called his toy box, a customized 28-foot trailer that he had meticulously modified with soundproofing insulation, a ventilation system, mirrors mounted on the ceiling, an array of surgical instruments, scalpels, handcuffs, leg irons, electrical shock devices, and a gynecological examination table equipped with custom restraints designed to hold a human being completely immobile. Ray had also compiled a detailed written manual, spanning 11 pages, that outlined in precise clinical language the procedures for kidnapping, restraining, interrogating, torturing, and ultimately disposing of a victim, a document that revealed not impulsive violence but a cold, calculated, and deeply premeditated obsession with inflicting pain and exercising absolute control over other human beings. The full scope of Ray's crimes might never have come to light had it not been for the extraordinary courage and resourcefulness of a 22-year-old woman named Cynthia Vigil, who on March 22, 1999, managed to escape from the toy box while Ray was away from the property, seizing a momentary lapse in supervision by Ray's accomplice, Cindy Hendy, to attack Hendy with an ice pick, break free from her restraints, and flee naked and bleeding across the desert until she reached a nearby home, where she banged on the door and screamed for help. When Sierra County deputies arrived at the scene and Vigil described what had happened to her, detailing the trailer, the instruments, the prolonged torture, and the audio tape that Ray had played for her upon her capture, in which a mechanical voice described in graphic detail the horrors that were about to be inflicted upon her, the officers initially struggled to comprehend the sheer scale of depravity they were being told about, but upon driving to Ray's property and entering the trailer, they discovered that every detail of Vigil's account was not only true but understated in its horror. Inside the toy box, investigators found the examination table still rigged with restraints, a collection of whips, chains, clamps, syringes, and a video camera setup that Ray used to record the torture sessions, footage that was later described by seasoned investigators as among the most disturbing material they had ever encountered, showing women in various states of bound terror being subjected to electrical shocks, waterboarding, and sexual assault over periods of hours and even days. The investigation, which was taken over by the New Mexico State Police and assisted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, quickly expanded as detectives began to identify additional victims and connect Ray to a pattern of disappearances that had plagued the region for years, cases of women who had vanished from the Elephant Butte and Truth or Consequences areas without a trace, their disappearances previously attributed to voluntary departures or the inherent dangers of living near remote desert terrain. David Parker Ray was arrested on March 24, 1999, along with Cindy Hendy, who was found inside Ray's mobile home attempting to clean the trailer and destroy evidence. A third accomplice, Ray's daughter Glenda Jean Jesse, was also later arrested and charged for her role in assisting her father in at least one kidnapping. As the investigation deepened, the forensic work became extraordinarily complex, involving the painstaking excavation of Ray's property and surrounding desert areas, the analysis of hundreds of hours of video and audio recordings recovered from the trailer and Ray's residence, and the coordination of witness testimonies from surviving victims who had been too traumatized, ashamed, or fearful to come forward until Vigil's escape provided them with the first tangible reason to believe that their tormentor might actually face justice. A second surviving victim, a woman who identified herself only as Angelica, came forward to describe how Ray had abducted her, held her in the trailer for days, subjected her to repeated acts of torture and sexual violence, and then released her with a warning that if she ever spoke about what had happened, he would find her and kill her, a threat that had kept her silent for months until Vigil's escape made headlines across New Mexico. The trial of David Parker Ray began in September 2000 in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, with the prosecution, led by Attorney General Patricia Madrid, facing the extraordinary challenge of presenting evidence of crime so extreme that jurors struggled to maintain their composure during the proceedings. The prosecution presented Vigil's harrowing testimony, the physical evidence from the toy box, the written manual, and the recorded audio tape, which was played in full in the courtroom, causing several jurors to weep openly and requiring the judge to call multiple recesses to allow the courtroom to regain its collective composure. The defense, led by attorney Gary Mitchell, did not dispute the existence of the trailer or the tapes but argued that the state had failed to prove that Ray had actually committed the specific acts of torture and kidnapping described by the victims, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that the trailer might have been used for consensual role-playing, an argument that the prosecution dismantled by pointing to the detailed abduction manual, the presence of sedative drugs in Ray's possession, and the unmistakable expressions of terror on the faces of the women in the recovered video recordings. In a verdict that shocked many observers who had expected a swift conviction on all counts, the first trial ended in a mistrial on September 27, 2000, when the jury reported that it was deadlocked after deliberating for more than 20 hours, with a small minority of jurors apparently unable to overcome the defense's reasonable doubt arguments despite the overwhelming volume of evidence. The prosecution immediately announced its intention to retry Ray, and a second trial on charges related to the kidnapping and torture of a different victim resulted in convictions on 12 counts, including kidnapping, criminal sexual penetration, and conspiracy, leading Judge William Perkins to sentence Ray to 224 years in prison, ensuring that he would never be released. Cindy Hendy, who had cooperated with investigators and agreed to testify against Ray in exchange for a reduced sentence, pleaded guilty to kidnapping and conspiracy and was sentenced to 36 years in prison. Glenda Jesse, Ray's daughter, pleaded guilty to kidnapping and conspiracy and received a sentence of 9 years. While David Parker Ray was never convicted of murder, despite the strong suspicions of law enforcement that he had killed an unknown number of victims whose bodies were buried in the vast desert surrounding Elephant Butte. The scope of what was proven in court was more than sufficient to cement his status as one of the most depraved criminals in American history. Investigators spent years searching the desert around Ray's property, uncovering thousands of bone fragments and personal items belonging to women, but the extreme environmental conditions of the New Mexico desert, combined with the passage of time and the scavenging activity of wildlife, made positive identification of remains exceedingly difficult, and no additional murder charges were ever filed. David Parker Ray died of a heart attack on May 28, 2002, at the age of 62, while serving his sentence at the Lea County Correctional Facility in Hobbs, New Mexico, taking whatever secrets remained about the full number of his victims to his grave. For the community of Elephant Butte, the revelation that a quiet neighbor had been operating a torture chamber in their midst produced a psychological trauma that lingered for years, shattering the illusion of safety that small-town life had always provided and forcing residents to confront the uncomfortable reality that evil does not require a metropolitan setting to flourish, that it can take root anywhere, even in the most remote and seemingly peaceful corners of the American landscape. The case also prompted significant changes in the way law enforcement agencies in rural New Mexico approached missing persons cases, leading to the creation of specialized task forces designed to identify patterns in disappearances that might previously have been dismissed as isolated incidents, and it underscored the critical importance of believing and supporting victims of sexual violence whose silence is often maintained not by choice but by the paralyzing weight of terror instilled by perpetrators like David Parker Ray. Number 3, Charlie Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate, a teenage couple whose killing spree across the winter plains of Nebraska and Wyoming in the late 1950s left 11 people dead and an entire region paralyzed by fear. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska, into a working-class family that struggled to make ends meet during the tail end of the Great Depression, and from an early age, Charlie exhibited signs of severe emotional disturbance that went largely unaddressed in an era when mental health treatment for children was virtually non-existent and behavioral problems in poor families were typically met with punishment rather than intervention. He suffered from a congenital bone deformity in his legs that affected his gait and made him the target of relentless bullying throughout his school years, and he developed a severe speech impediment that further isolated him from his peers, creating a cycle of humiliation, rage, and withdrawal that intensified as he entered adolescence and found himself unable to form normal social relationships or succeed in the conventional pathways that small-town Midwestern life offered to young men. Carol Ann Fugate was 3 years younger than Charlie, born in 1943, and came from a similarly modest background, a quiet girl who became infatuated with Starkweather during her early teens, drawn to his rebellious attitude and the dangerous aura that surrounded him, an attraction that her parents deeply disapproved of and tried repeatedly to suppress by forbidding Carol from seeing Charlie, a prohibition that only seemed to strengthen the bond between the two teenagers and push their relationship further into a realm of secrecy and defiance that would eventually curdle into something far more sinister. The killing spree began on December 1, 1957, when Starkweather, who had been working as a garbage collector in Lincoln, went to a gas station operated by Robert Calvert, a 21-year-old man whom Charlie had encountered before during his routes. During the robbery, which netted Starkweather a small amount of cash from the register, Calvert was forced at gunpoint to drive Starkweather to a remote area outside the city limits, where Charlie shot him in the head and left his body in the frozen Nebraska countryside. A murder that went unsolved for more than a year because Starkweather was not initially considered a suspect and the crime scene offered few forensic clues in an era before modern DNA analysis and comprehensive fingerprint databases. It was not until January 21, 1959, that the true magnitude of Starkweather's capacity for violence became apparent, when he showed up at the home of Carol Ann Fugate and found that her mother and stepfather, Velda and Marion Bartlett, had forbidden Carol from seeing him, a rejection that ignited a fury in Charlie that had been smoldering for years and that he discharged with horrifying swiftness by shooting and killing Marion Bartlett, then strangling and fatally shooting Velda Bartlett, and finally battering to death Carol Ann's 2-year-old half-sister, Betty Jean Bartlett, whose tiny body was found wedged inside a coal bin in the basement of the small Lincoln home. Starkweather then remained in the house with Carol for several days, during which time neighbors who came to the door asking about the family were told that they were all sick with the flu, a ruse that allowed Charlie to plan his next moves while the bodies of Carol and his family lay decomposing in the house. When neighbors eventually grew suspicious enough to call the police, Starkweather and Fugate fled Lincoln in a stolen car, setting in motion a spree that covered nearly 300 miles across Nebraska and into Wyoming over the course of 8 days and claimed the lives of 7 more people in a sequence of seemingly random encounters that defied any rational explanation and turned the entire Great Plains region into a zone of panicked lockdown. On January 27, Starkweather forced his way into the home of August Meyer, a 70-year-old farmer who lived in a remote area outside Lincoln, and shot him to death, and when Meyer's 17-year-old housekeeper, Robert Jensen, arrived at the property shortly afterward, Starkweather killed him as well, before kidnapping Jensen's girlfriend, Lillian Fensel, driving her to an abandoned shed, and shooting her in the head. On January 28, the couple arrived at a used car lot in Lincoln operated by a man named Clinton Baugh, whom Starkweather shot and killed before stealing a vehicle and fleeing the city with Carol, heading westward toward the Wyoming border. On January 29, Starkweather broke into the home of the Jensen family in the small town of Bennett, Nebraska, murdering the parents, Carl and Alice Jensen, before kidnapping their teenage children, Carol and Jensen and her younger brother, and driving them to a remote area where he shot both children, Carol dying from her wounds but her brother surviving with serious injuries that left him with permanent disabilities. The spree reached its bloody culmination on January 31 in Douglas, Wyoming, where Starkweather and Fugate pulled into a rest area and encountered a traveling salesman named Merle Collison, whom Charlie shot and killed before attempting to steal his car, an act that was interrupted by the arrival of a passing motorist who initially believed he was witnessing a domestic dispute but quickly realized the gravity of the situation and wrestled a rifle away from Starkweather as a crowd of bystanders gathered. By this time, word of the killing spree had spread across the region through radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines, and the citizens of Douglas, alerted to the danger, surrounded Starkweather and Fugate's vehicle until the local sheriff arrived and took them into custody without further violence. The arrest of Charlie Starkweather and Carol and Fugate on January 31, 1959, brought to an end one of the most violent and perplexing crime sprees in American history, and the subsequent investigation, led by the Lincoln Police Department in coordination with multiple county sheriff's offices and the Wyoming Highway Patrol, revealed a trail of evidence that stretched across 2 states and included the stolen vehicles, the murder weapons, eyewitness accounts from survivors and bystanders, and the testimony of Carol and Fugate, who almost immediately began telling investigators that she had been a hostage throughout the entire ordeal and that Starkweather had threatened to kill her and her family if she did not comply with his demands. The trial of Charlie Starkweather began in May 1959 in Lancaster County, Nebraska, with the prosecution, led by Attorney General Clarence S. Burns, presenting a mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence that tied Starkweather to every murder, and while the defense, led by Attorney John MacArthur, attempted to argue that Starkweather was legally insane, having been diagnosed with a severe personality disorder and possible schizophrenia by court-appointed psychiatrists, the jury rejected this defense after deliberating for less than 2 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. Starkweather was sentenced to death in the electric chair and was executed on June 25, 1959, at the Nebraska State Penitentiary in Lincoln, just over 5 months after his arrest. A remarkably swift progression from crime to punishment that reflected the overwhelming public outrage generated by the spree and the lack of legal mechanisms available at the time for extended appeals in capital cases. Carol and Fugate was tried separately, and her trial became a focal point of intense national debate about the nature of female criminality, the psychology of coercion, and the question of whether a teenage girl could be held equally responsible for murders committed by her older boyfriend. Fugate testified that she had been terrified of Starkweather throughout the spree, that he had killed her family in front of her and then threatened to kill her if she tried to escape or alert anyone, and that she had been a passive prisoner rather than an active participant in the violence. The jury, however, was unconvinced by this defense, noting that Fugate had multiple opportunities to flee or seek help during the 8-day spree and that witnesses had reported seeing her appear calm and even laughing at certain points during the journey. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, becoming the youngest female in American history at that time to be convicted of first-degree murder. Fugate served 17 years at the Nebraska Center for Women in York, Nebraska, before being paroled in 1976, after which she moved to Michigan, changed her name, and lived a quiet life, maintaining until the end of her life that she had been a victim of Starkweather rather than his willing accomplice, a claim that continues to be debated by criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts to this day. For the communities of Lincoln, Bennett, and Douglas, the Starkweather Fugate spree was a watershed moment that destroyed the collective sense of security that had defined rural Midwestern life for generations, proving that the kind of random, motiveless violence that Americans associated with big cities could erupt just as easily on a quiet country road or inside a modest farmhouse on a winter afternoon. The case also had a profound cultural impact, inspiring books, films, and songs that cemented Starkweather's image as a symbol of alienated youth turned lethal, most notably the 1973 film Badlands directed by Terrence Malick, which used the Starkweather Fugate story as the basis for a haunting meditation on the banality of evil and the terrifying ease with which ordinary landscapes can become backdrops for extraordinary horror. Number 4, Dennis Rader, the church council president and municipal code enforcement officer who terrorized the city of Wichita, Kansas, for over 3 decades under the self-appointed moniker BTK, an acronym that stood for bind, torture, kill, a chilling label he created for himself and that accurately summarized the grim methodology he employed against the 10 innocent people whose lives he extinguished between 1974 and 1991. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, one of 4 sons born to a modest working-class family, and his early life presented no obvious indicators of the profound darkness that would eventually define him, as he grew up in a stable household, attended local schools, participated in Boy Scouts, and was by all accounts a quiet, unremarkable child who did not draw attention to himself through either exceptional achievement or troubling behavior. After graduating from high school, Rader enlisted in the United States Air Force, serving from 1966 to 1970 at bases in Alabama, Texas, and overseas, where he worked as a mechanic and an equipment manager, earning commendations for his reliability and attention to detail, skills that would later manifest in a far more sinister context when he applied the same meticulous precision to the planning and execution of his murders. Following his honorable discharge from the military, Rader returned to Kansas, enrolled at Wichita State University, and earned a degree in administration of justice in 1979, a field of study that has since been the subject of intense psychological analysis, as it suggests that Rader was not only pursuing a career that would place him in proximity to law enforcement but was also actively studying the systems and procedures that investigators use to solve crimes, knowledge that he would later exploit with devastating effectiveness to avoid capture for more than 30 years. Rader married his wife, Paula, in 1971, and the couple settled in the Park City neighborhood just north of Wichita, where they raised 2 children and became deeply embedded in the suburban community, with Rader serving as president of the Christ Lutheran Church, volunteering as a Cub Scout leader, and working first as an air conditioning installer and later as a municipal code enforcement officer for the city of Park City, a position that required him to patrol neighborhoods, inspect properties, and interact with residents on a daily basis, all of which provided him with a veneer of authority and normalcy that made it virtually impossible for anyone in his community to suspect that the man they saw at church on Sunday morning was the same individual who had been leaving corpses in homes across the Wichita metropolitan area since the early 1970s. Rader's first known murders occurred on January 15, 1974, when he entered the home of Joseph and Julie Otero at 6083 North Edgemore Street in Wichita, a house he had been watching for some time, having identified the family through a process of surveillance that involved stalking the property from a distance, learning the family's routines, and determining the optimal time to strike when the occupants would be most vulnerable. Once inside the home, Rader, armed with a pistol, subdued the entire Otero family, which included Joseph, a 38-year-old Air Force veteran, his wife Julie, 34, and 2 of their children, Josephine, 11, and Joseph Jr., 9. Rader bound each family member with rope and cord that he had brought with him, a signature element of his criminal methodology that reflected both his need for total physical control over his victims and his compulsive attention to the specific knots and binding configurations that he would later describe in his communications with law enforcement in clinical, almost academic detail. He strangled Joseph Otero, then Julie Otero, and then the two children, killing them in a sequence that he later explained was designed to maximize the psychological terror experienced by each victim as they watched their family members die before their own turn came. After the murders, raiders spent time inside the Otero home, arranging the bodies in specific positions, taking photographs, and simply existing in the space that he had transformed from a family home into a tableau of death. A behavior that psychologists who later studied the case identified as characteristic of an organized serial killer who derives prolonged satisfaction not only from the act of killing itself but from the post-mortem manipulation of the crime scene and the creation of a personal narrative around the violence. The Otero murders sent a shockwave of fear through Wichita that was unlike anything the city had experienced before, as the sheer brutality of the crime, the targeting of an entire family including young children, and the absence of any obvious motive such as robbery or personal vendetta suggested that the community was dealing with a predator who killed for reasons that ordinary citizens could not comprehend. Over the following 17 years, Rader murdered 6 more people, each attack following a similar pattern of surveillance, intrusion, binding, strangulation, and post-mortem staging that revealed an evolving but consistent modus operandi. His victims included Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman murdered in April 1974, who fought back against her attacker with extraordinary ferocity and actually managed to bite Rader severely enough that he later expressed genuine fear that she had drawn blood that could be used to identify him, a concern that contributed to a nearly 4-year gap between his second and third murders as he refined his approach and became even more careful about leaving forensic evidence. Shirley Vian Relford, a 28-year-old mother of 3 young children, was murdered on March 17, 1977, in her home on South Hydraulic Street where Rader broke in, bound Shirley, and locked her 3 terrified children in a bathroom while he strangled her in the bedroom, an act of cruelty that underscored his complete indifference to the psychological devastation inflicted on surviving witnesses. Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old schoolteacher, was murdered on December 8, 1977, in her apartment, and it was after this killing that Rader initiated the communication strategy that would eventually give him his notorious public identity, sending a letter to the Wichita Eagle-Beacon newspaper in which he described the Fox murder in detail, claimed responsibility for several previous killings, and for the first time used the name BTK, writing that he had been unable to control his compulsion to kill and that the binding, torturing, and killing of his victims provided him with a satisfaction that he could not achieve through any other means. Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old woman, was murdered on April 27, 1985, after Rader broke into her home and transported her body to a remote location where he strangled her and left her body in a ditch. Vicki Wegerle, a 28-year-old mother, was murdered on September 16, 1986, in her home, and Rader took photographs of her body at the scene, photographs that would not surface for nearly 2 decades until Rader himself sent them to police during his final communication campaign. Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman, was murdered on January 19, 1991, becoming Rader's 10th and final known victim, taken from her home and strangled at a location several miles away before her body was discovered in a ditch near a bridge. Throughout this period, the Wichita Police Department, assisted at various times by the Kansas Bureau of Investigation and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, pursued the BTK investigation with an intensity that consumed enormous resources and generated thousands of leads, but Rader's meticulous avoidance of forensic evidence, his deep knowledge of investigative procedures, and his ability to present himself as a completely ordinary and trustworthy member of the community made him an essentially invisible suspect. Rader's decision to resume communications with law enforcement and the media in 2004, after a long period of silence that had led many to believe he was either dead or incarcerated for other crimes, was ultimately what led to his downfall, as his need for attention and recognition, which had always been a central component of his psychological profile, overrode his carefully cultivated discipline and led him to make a series of critical errors. In 2005, Rader sent a floppy disk to a Wichita television station, and although he had taken precautions to obscure its origin, forensic analysts at the FBI were able to extract metadata from the disk that identified it as having been last used on a computer at the Park City Public Library, a breakthrough that narrowed the search to a remarkably small pool of individuals. Investigators then cross-referenced the library computer usage records with the BTK case files and quickly identified Dennis Rader as a person of interest, as he not only matched the general profile that had been developed over the years but had a documented connection to the library and no credible alibi for any of the murders. Surveillance was established on Rader, and a DNA sample was obtained covertly from his daughter's medical records, which showed a familial match to DNA evidence recovered from the BTK crime scenes, providing the scientific confirmation that investigators needed to make an arrest. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over while driving near his home in Park City and taken into custody without incident, and when detectives began interrogating him, they discovered a man who was almost eager to confess, who spoke about his crimes in the same detached, methodical tone that he had used in his letters, and who seemed genuinely confused about why society viewed his actions as monstrous rather than as the fulfillment of a natural biological imperative that he had been born with. During his interrogation, which was recorded over several hours, Rader provided extraordinarily detailed accounts of each murder, describing his thought processes, his surveillance methods, his choice of binding materials, the specific sensations he experienced during the killings, and the elaborate fantasy life that he had constructed around his BTK persona, a fantasy that included creating elaborate drawings, writing fictionalized accounts of his crimes, and even planning a torture chamber that he hoped to build if he could ever acquire a suitable property. Rader pleaded guilty on June 27, 2005, to 10 counts of first-degree murder, and the bench trial, in which he delivered a disturbingly calm and detailed recitation of each crime, concluded with Judge Gregory Waller sentencing him to 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, a sentence that was mandated by Kansas law at the time, as the state did not have the death penalty in effect for the period during which most of the murders were committed. The BTK case sent shockwaves through the field of criminal psychology and forensic science, as it demonstrated both the extraordinary capabilities of modern forensic technology, particularly the ability to extract identifying information from digital media, and the frightening reality that a serial killer could operate undetected for decades while maintaining a completely normal public facade that included marriage, parenthood, church leadership, and civic employment. For the city of Wichita, the revelation that BTK was not a shadowy figure operating on the margins of society but a code enforcement officer who had likely walked through the neighborhoods of his victims without raising any suspicion was a profound betrayal of the trust that residents placed in the ordinary structures of community life, and the case left scars on the families of the victims that were deepened by the knowledge that their loved ones had died at the hands of a man who had been living among them, attending church potlucks, enforcing city ordinances, and coaching their children in Cub Scouts throughout the entire period of his killing career. Number 5, Tommy Lynn Sells, a transient drifter who moved through the underbelly of rural America like an invisible predator, leaving a trail of bodies across at least a dozen states before a 13-year-old girl's extraordinary courage and survival instinct finally brought his decades-long rampage to an end in the small border town of Del Rio, Texas. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, and his early life was characterized by the kind of profound instability and neglect that criminologists have long identified as fertile ground for the development of severe antisocial personality disorders, as he was abandoned by his biological parents at an extremely young age and was subsequently placed with relatives in Missouri who provided minimal supervision and no emotional support, allowing Sells to roam freely through the rural Ozarks region from the time he was a small child, effectively raising himself in an environment where he learned to survive by his wits, his fists, and his ability to read people and situations with a predator's instinctive precision. By the time he was a teenager, Sells had already developed a pattern of criminal behavior that included burglary, theft, and random acts of violence, and he spent time in juvenile detention facilities where, rather than being rehabilitated, he became further immersed in a criminal subculture that reinforced his belief that rules were for other people and that his own desires and impulses were the only legitimate guide for his behavior. As an adult, Sells lived a completely transient existence, hitchhiking, riding freight trains, and drifting from town to town across the American South and Southwest, working only sporadically at odd jobs and supporting himself primarily through theft and manipulation. A lifestyle that not only allowed him to evade law enforcement by never staying in one place long enough to attract sustained attention but also provided him with a constant stream of vulnerable targets, people who were alone, isolated, or otherwise unlikely to be missed immediately, allowing Sells to kill without the urgency of a fixed location tying him to the crime. The full scope of Sells's murder spree may never be known with absolute certainty, as he himself confessed to dozens of killings during interviews with law enforcement and with a Texas Ranger named John Allen, who spent hundreds of hours building a rapport with Sells and eliciting confessions that spanned multiple states and decades. But many of these confessions involved cases where corroborating evidence was insufficient to support prosecution, leaving Sells as a confirmed perpetrator in a relatively small number of cases despite his claims of having killed as many as 70 people. What is definitively known is that Sells's confirmed victims included a 4-year-old girl named Anna Court in Springfield, Missouri, in 1985, whose body was found in an abandoned house after Sells had been invited into her family's home by the child's mother. A woman Sells had met at a local bar and who had no reason to suspect that the charming stranger she had brought home was a serial killer who would slip away in the night after murdering her daughter in an adjacent room. He was also confirmed as the killer of Stephanie Mahaney, a 22-year-old woman who was stabbed to death in Guthrie, Oklahoma, in 1986, and of Keith Lawrence, a 29-year-old man murdered in Brenham, Texas, in 1987, among several other victims in Texas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Illinois, and other states where Sells's path intersected with the lives of people who had the misfortune of encountering him at a moment when his violent impulses surged beyond his capacity to suppress them. The case that ultimately brought Sells to justice began on December 31, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas, a small city of approximately 35,000 people situated on the border with Mexico, a community defined by its connection to the international crossing at the Rio Grande and by a pace of life that was, for the most part, quiet and unremarkable, a place where New Year's Eve was typically celebrated with family gatherings, backyard parties, and a sense of communal safety that made it difficult for residents to imagine that a prolific serial killer was passing through their midst on the final night of the millennium. On that evening, Sells, who had been drifting through Texas for several weeks, somehow gained access to the home of Terry and Mary Harris, where their 13-year-old daughter Kayleen was spending the night with her best friend, 10-year-old Crystal Searles, a sleepover that should have been a routine childhood experience but that instead became the setting for one of the most harrowing survival stories in the history of American criminal justice. Sometime during the night, Sells entered the Harris home, armed with a knife, and moved through the house with a stealth that suggested long practice at entering and exiting dwellings without detection, a skill he had honed through years of burglary and breaking and entering crimes that had never resulted in serious consequences. He encountered Kayleen Harris first, and in an act of violence that was both swift and devastating, he slashed her throat, killing her almost instantly as she slept in her bed, a death that was as silent as it was brutal, designed to eliminate the first obstacle without awakening the rest of the household. Sells then turned his attention to Crystal Searles, who was sleeping in the same room on a separate bed, and he slashed her throat as well, but the cut he inflicted on Crystal was not as deep or as precisely placed as the one that had killed Kayleen, a small but critical deviation that would prove to be the single most important factor in the eventual capture and conviction of a man who had been killing with impunity for more than 15 years. When Sells left the Harris home, believing that both girls were dead or dying, Crystal Searles, despite having a deep and bleeding wound to her throat that would have been fatal without medical intervention, managed to summon a reserve of courage and presence of mind that defies comprehension for a child of her age, crawling through the dark house with her throat cut open, stepping over or around the body of her best friend, and making her way to a neighboring property where she banged on the door until a startled resident opened it to find a 10-year-old girl covered in blood, gasping for air through her wounds, and gesturing frantically for help. Crystal was rushed to Val Verde Regional Medical Center in Del Rio, where emergency surgeons performed a procedure that saved her life by repairing the severed structures in her neck, and it was during her recovery in the hours that followed that Crystal, still in critical condition and surrounded by medical staff and law enforcement officers, provided a description of her attacker that was as remarkable in its clarity as it was extraordinary given the trauma she had just endured. She described a white male with long hair and a distinctive facial appearance, details that were consistent enough to allow a composite sketch to be created and distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. More importantly, Crystal was able to provide investigators with details about the sequence of events inside the house, information that helped crime scene technicians understand the spatial dynamics of the attack and recover critical forensic evidence, including fingerprints and hair fibers that did not match anyone associated with the Harris family or their known associates. The investigation into Kayleen Harris's murder was led by the Val Verde County Sheriff's Office in coordination with the Texas Rangers, and within days, the fingerprint evidence recovered from the Harris home had been run through the National Automated Fingerprint Identification System and returned a match to Tommy Lynn Sells, whose prints were in the system as a result of his numerous prior arrests for various minor offenses across multiple states, arrests that had never resulted in the kind of serious consequences that might have stopped his killing spree years earlier but that had at least placed his biometric data in a database that would now prove to be his undoing. Sells was located on January 2, 2000, at a homeless shelter in Salt Lake City, Utah, more than 1,000 miles from Del Rio, having continued his pattern of drifting immediately after the murders, and he was taken into custody by local police and FBI agents without resistance. A stark contrast to the violence he had inflicted on his victims and a behavioral pattern that forensic psychologists have noted is common among predatory killers who reserve their aggression for those they perceive as vulnerable while remaining submissive and compliant when confronted by authority figures who represent a threat to their freedom. During the interrogation that followed his arrest, Sells initially denied involvement in the Harris murder, but when confronted with the fingerprint evidence and the eyewitness identification by Crystal Searles, who had by this point recovered sufficiently to view a lineup and confidently identify Sells as the man who had killed her friend and slashed her throat, he began to talk, and once he started talking, he did not stop for hours, unleashing a torrent of confessions that spanned years and geography and revealed a level of criminality that even experienced investigators found staggering in its scope and brutality. Sells was charged with the capital murder of Kayleen Harris, and his trial took place in Del Rio in the fall of 2000, a proceeding that was dominated by the testimony of Crystal Searles, who took the witness stand at 11 years old and looked directly at the man who had tried to kill her, describing in a steady and unwavering voice the events of the night that had taken her best friend's life and nearly taken her own, a performance that left the courtroom in stunned silence and moved even the most hardened legal professionals to tears. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Fred Hernandez, presented a case built on forensic evidence, eyewitness identification, and Sells's own confessions, while the defense, led by attorney Bobby Lott, attempted to argue that Sells suffered from mental illness and that his confessions were unreliable and potentially coerced, arguments that the jury rejected after deliberating for less than 3 hours, returning a verdict of guilty on the capital murder charge. On September 23, 2000, the jury recommended that Sells be sentenced to death, and the judge formally imposed the sentence, making Tommy Lynn Sells one of the few serial killers in Texas history to be condemned to death for a single murder despite overwhelming evidence of many others. While on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, Sells continued to communicate with investigators, media, and true crime authors, providing additional details about his crimes and his upbringing that added depth to the psychological profile of a man who killed not out of passion or revenge but out of a generalized and compulsive need to destroy life that was triggered by almost any opportunity that presented itself. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 2014, at the Huntsville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and his final statement, in which he expressed love for his family and claimed that he was at peace, was met with the same skepticism and contempt that had characterized every word he had spoken since his arrest, as those who had studied his case understood that Sells's capacity for deception was as developed as his capacity for violence, and that no expression of remorse or contrition from him could be accepted at face value. For the small community of Del Rio, the Sells case was a traumatic rupture in the fabric of daily life that forced residents to confront the reality that their proximity to the border, while bringing economic and cultural benefits, also created a transient population through which dangerous individuals could move with relative anonymity, and the case prompted significant improvements in the way local law enforcement agencies shared information about transients and persons of interest moving through border communities. For Crystal Searles, whose survival and testimony made the conviction possible, the aftermath of the crime was a long and painful process of physical and emotional recovery that required years of counseling and the support of a family that rallied around her with extraordinary love and dedication. And her story became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity of even the youngest and most vulnerable among us to demonstrate a level of bravery that can change the course of justice. Number 6, Richard Allen Davis, a career criminal with a decades-long record of violence whose abduction and murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas from her own home during a slumber party in the small California town of Petaluma became a defining moment in American criminal justice history and directly catalyzed the passage of the most sweeping sentencing reform law in the history of the United States. Richard Allen Davis was born on June 2, 1954, in San Francisco, California, into a household defined by severe dysfunction, alcoholism, and physical abuse, conditions that set him on a trajectory of criminal behavior that began in his early adolescence and accelerated with a grim consistency throughout his adult life, as Davis accumulated a rap sheet that read like a catalog of every form of predatory violence a human being can inflict on another, including burglaries, assaults, kidnappings, sexual assaults, and attempted murders, a pattern of criminality that was so persistent and so clearly escalating in severity that it became a textbook case study in the catastrophic failures of the criminal justice system to protect the public from a known and unrepentant predator. Davis's criminal history stretched back to 1967, when he was just 13 years old and was arrested for a burglary in San Francisco, and from that point forward, he cycled in and out of the California correctional system with a frequency that became almost routine, each release followed by a new arrest for a more serious offense, each sentence serving as little more than a temporary interruption in a career of crime that showed no signs of abatement despite multiple attempts at rehabilitation that Davis himself treated with contemptuous disregard. In 1976, Davis was convicted of kidnapping a woman at knife point and attempting to sexually assault her, a crime for which he received a sentence that, under the laws and sentencing practices of the era, resulted in his release after a relatively short period of incarceration, a pattern that would repeat itself multiple times over the following years as Davis was convicted of similar offenses and released back into the community with no meaningful supervision or intervention designed to address the root causes of his violent behavior. By 1993, Davis had been in and out of prison so many times that he had become known to law enforcement throughout Northern California as a highly dangerous and unpredictable individual, and he was, at the time of the Polly Klaas murder, on parole from a prison term for a previous kidnapping and assault conviction, a fact that would later become the central focus of intense public anger and political scrutiny as details of his criminal history emerged in the aftermath of the crime. Petaluma, California, where the Klaas family lived, is a small city in Sonoma County, approximately 40 miles north of San Francisco, known for its historic downtown, its agricultural heritage, and its reputation as one of the safest communities in the Bay Area, a place where families moved specifically to provide their children with the kind of upbringing that combined small-town security with access to the cultural and economic benefits of proximity to a major metropolitan area. It was in this community, on October 1, 1993, that Polly Hannah Klaas, a bright and vivacious 12-year-old girl with curly brown hair and a gap-toothed smile that her mother described as capable of lighting up any room she entered, invited two friends over to her home on Faulkner Drive for a slumber party, an event so ordinary and so deeply embedded in the fabric of American childhood that it seemed to exist in a dimension entirely separate from the kind of violence that Richard Allen Davis represented. Polly's mother, Marcia Klaas, was at home that evening, and the girls were in Polly's bedroom playing a game of truth or dare when a man appeared in the bedroom doorway holding a knife, a figure who seemed to materialize from the darkness of the quiet suburban neighborhood like a physical manifestation of every parent's worst nightmare. The man, who was later identified as Richard Allen Davis, told the girls to be quiet and threatened them with the knife, then grabbed Polly by the arm and began pulling her out of the room, pausing briefly to tie up the two friends with a length of cloth he had brought with him, a calculated act that demonstrated both forethought and a chilling ability to maintain control over a chaotic and terrifying situation. Marcia Klaas, who had been in another part of the house, entered Polly's bedroom to find the two bound girls screaming and Polly gone, and the call she made to the 911 emergency dispatch system at approximately 10:45 that evening became one of the most famous and most replayed emergency calls in American history, capturing in real time the raw, unfiltered sound of a mother discovering that her child had been taken from her own home, a sound that when broadcast on national television in the days that followed, galvanized the entire nation in a way that few crimes had ever done before. The Petaluma Police Department responded to the call within minutes, and the initial investigation was immediately designated as a highest priority kidnapping case, with every available officer mobilized to search the neighborhood, establish roadblocks, and begin the process of gathering whatever evidence could be found at the scene. The FBI was brought in within hours, and a massive search effort was organized that ultimately involved thousands of volunteers from the Petaluma community and surrounding areas, people who dropped everything, left their jobs, and walked through fields, wooded areas, and empty lots in a desperate, collective effort to find a 12-year-old girl who had been snatched from her own bedroom on a Friday night. For 65 days, the search for Polly Klaas consumed the attention of the nation, as her face appeared on television screens, milk cartons, and flyers distributed across every state in the country, and the case became a media phenomenon that transcended the boundaries of true crime reporting and entered the broader cultural conversation about the safety of children, the adequacy of the criminal justice system, and the fundamental question of whether any community could truly protect its most vulnerable members from predators who moved among them unseen. The breakthrough in the case came on November 28, 1993, when a property owner named James McNabb reported seeing a suspicious vehicle, a red Ford Pinto station wagon, parked on a remote stretch of land near his property on Pythian Road in Sonoma County, an area of dense woodland and rugged terrain that was several miles from the Klaas home. When deputies from the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office responded to investigate the abandoned vehicle, they discovered that it was registered to Richard Allen Davis, and a subsequent search of the surrounding area, conducted by a team of investigators and search dogs, led to the discovery of Polly Klaas's body in a shallow grave in a thicket of brush just off a logging road approximately 2 miles from where the vehicle had been found. The autopsy revealed that Polly had been strangled to death, and the condition of the crime scene and the body suggested that she had been alive for some period of time after her abduction before being murdered and left in the remote location where she would remain undiscovered for nearly 2 months despite the enormous search effort that had been concentrated in the area. Davis was arrested on November 30, 1993, in a remote area near the town of Ukiah in Mendocino County, where he had been living in a makeshift campsite and was recognized by a local resident who had seen his photograph on a news broadcast about the Polly Klaas investigation. He was taken into custody without incident and transported to the Sonoma County Jail, where he was interrogated by detectives and, after initially denying any involvement in the crime, eventually confessed to the abduction and murder of Polly Klaas, providing details about the crime that had not been released to the public and that only the perpetrator could have known, including the specific route he had driven after leaving the Klaas home, the location where he had killed Polly, and the process by which he had concealed her body in the shallow grave. The trial of Richard Allen Davis began on June 8, 1996, in the Superior Court of Sonoma County, with Judge Thomas Brigham presiding over a proceeding that was moved to Santa Clara County on a change of venue due to the extraordinary level of pretrial publicity that had saturated the Bay Area for more than 2 years. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Greg Jacobs, presented a case that was built on forensic evidence, including DNA and fiber analysis that linked Davis to the Klaas home and to Polly's body, the confession that Davis had given to investigators, and the testimony of the 2 girls who had been tied up in Polly's bedroom and who identified Davis in court as the man who had taken their friend. The defense, led by attorney Barry Collins, attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of the confession, arguing that Davis had been manipulated by interrogators and that his statements were inconsistent in certain details, but the jury, which had listened to weeks of devastating evidence and had seen the autopsy photographs that showed the condition of Polly's body when it was recovered, was not persuaded by these arguments. On June 18, 1996, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder with special circumstances of kidnapping, burglary, and lewd and lascivious conduct on a child under the age of 14, charges that made Davis eligible for the death penalty under California law. The penalty phase of the trial concluded on August 5, 1996, when the jury recommended that Davis be sentenced to death, and Judge Brigham formally imposed the sentence, making Richard Allen Davis a resident of San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he remains to this day, having exhausted his initial round of appeals without success. The impact of the Polly Klaas case on American criminal justice was immediate, profound, and unprecedented in its scope. As the public outrage generated by the revelation that Davis had been on parole at the time of the murder despite a criminal history that clearly marked him as an extreme danger to the community fueled a political movement that resulted in the passage of California's 3 Strikes and You're Out law in 1994, a ballot initiative that mandated sentences of 25 years to life for any felony conviction if the defendant had 2 prior serious or violent felony convictions, a law that was designed specifically to ensure that individuals like Davis would never again be released into the community after demonstrating a pattern of serious criminal behavior. The 3 Strikes law was subsequently adopted in some form by 24 other states and by the federal government, making the murder of Polly Klaas one of the most legislatively consequential crimes in American history, a fact that provides cold comfort to Marcia Klaas, who became a tireless advocate for victims' rights and children's safety in the years following her daughter's death, channeling her grief into a force for systemic change that she hoped would prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation that had been visited upon hers. For the town of Petaluma, the memory of Polly Klaas remains a permanent and deeply felt presence in the community, marked by a memorial park dedicated to her memory, annual remembrance events, and a collective awareness that the safety that drew families to the town in the first place is not a permanent condition but a fragile state that must be actively maintained through vigilance, community engagement, and a criminal justice system that takes seriously its obligation to protect the innocent from those who have repeatedly demonstrated their willingness to do harm. Number 7, Monty Russell, a teenage boy who embarked on a rapid and brutal sequence of rapes and murders in the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Alexandria, Virginia, in the span of less than 1 year, shocking a community that had never experienced serial violence on this scale and revealing how a deeply disturbed adolescent could operate with devastating effectiveness before the age of majority. Monty Ralph Russell was born on April 14, 1959, in Anchorage, Alaska, and his early childhood, while marked by the difficulties inherent in growing up in a harsh and isolated environment, did not initially present the kind of overt warning signs that would later seem obvious in retrospect, as he was described by those who knew him in his earliest years as a quiet and somewhat withdrawn child who struggled to form friendships but who did not exhibit the kind of aggressive or violent behavior that typically precipitates intervention by social services or mental health professionals. The trajectory of Russell's life changed dramatically when his family relocated from Alaska to the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, settling in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, a historic suburb situated just across the Potomac River from the nation's capital, known for its tree-lined streets, its well-maintained colonial-era architecture, and its reputation as one of the most desirable and safest residential communities in the region, a place where federal employees, military officers, and professionals raised their families in an atmosphere of stability and order that seemed insulated from the violent crime that afflicted the urban core of nearby Washington. Russell was approximately 12 years old when the family moved to Alexandria, and the transition from the rugged frontier environment of Alaska to the densely populated and socially complex suburbs of Northern Virginia was profoundly disorienting for him, as he found himself in a world where social hierarchies were established through entirely different mechanisms than those he had understood in Alaska, and where his awkwardness, his slight physical stature, and his lack of familiarity with the cultural codes of suburban adolescence left him isolated, bullied, and increasingly resentful of a society that seemed to have no place for him. As he entered his teenage years, Russell's feelings of alienation curdled into a rage that he directed primarily at women and girls, a pattern of misogynistic hostility that was likely influenced by a combination of social rejection, hormonal imbalance, and an emerging personality disorder that caused him to view women not as human beings but as objects that existed either to satisfy his desires or to humiliate him through rejection, a distorted worldview that would eventually find its most extreme expression in a series of crimes that were remarkable for their rapid escalation from minor sexual offenses to homicide. Russell's first known contact with the criminal justice system occurred when he was 14 years old and was arrested for peeping into the windows of homes in his Alexandria neighborhood, a behavior that, while alarming, was treated by the juvenile authorities as a relatively minor offense that did not warrant serious intervention, a decision that in hindsight represented the first of several missed opportunities to identify and contain a young man whose sexual deviance was clearly progressing along a path that criminological research has consistently identified as a precursor to more serious violence. Russell's first known sexual assault occurred in February of 1976, when he was just 16 years old, and involved a woman whom he attacked in a residential area of Alexandria, a crime for which he was again processed through the juvenile justice system and again received a response that was wholly inadequate to the severity of his behavior, as the system's emphasis on rehabilitation over punishment for juvenile offenders meant that Russell was returned to the community with minimal supervision and no meaningful therapeutic intervention designed to address the underlying psychological drivers of his escalating criminality. It was less than 1 month after this initial assault that Russell committed his first murder, on March 12, 1976, when he encountered a 22-year-old woman named Aura Gabrielle Gabor in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Alexandria, forced her into her own vehicle at knife point, drove to a secluded area near the Potomac River, raped her, and then strangled her to death, leaving her body in a location where it was discovered the following day by a passerby. The murder of Aura Gabor sent a wave of fear through the Alexandria community, as the brutal and seemingly random nature of the crime suggested that a predator was operating in the area, but the investigation, led by the Alexandria Police Department in coordination with the Fairfax County Police and the FBI, was hampered by the absence of forensic evidence at the scene and the lack of any obvious connection between the victim and her killer, a situation that would soon change in ways that no one could have anticipated. Just 9 days after the murder of Aura Gabor, on March 21, 1976, Russell struck again, this time attacking a 29-year-old woman named Gladys Virginia Ross in the parking lot of a shopping center in Alexandria, raping and strangling her in a pattern that was nearly identical to the Gabor murder, and leaving her body in a location that suggested the killer was familiar with the geography of the area and had identified secluded spots where he could commit his crimes without being observed. Less than 2 weeks later, on April 3, 1976, Russell murdered his third victim, 34-year-old Ursula Bridget Sensberg, in yet another parking lot attack in Alexandria, and the pattern was now unmistakable. A serial killer was operating in the city with a frequency and a consistency that indicated a deep and worsening compulsion that was driving him to kill at intervals that were rapidly shrinking as his confidence grew and his ability to control his impulses deteriorated. The Alexandria Police Department, now operating under the overwhelming pressure that accompanies any active serial killer investigation, mobilized every available resource, including plainclothes officers stationed in parking lots, aerial surveillance of secluded areas, and a comprehensive canvass of neighborhoods where the attacks had occurred, but Russell, who was still only 16 years old and who lived with his mother in an apartment less than 2 miles from several of the attack sites, moved through this dragnet with an ease that reflected not criminal genius but the simple and devastating fact that no one was looking for a teenage boy, as the profile developed by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which was still in its formative stages and had limited experience with serial offenders of any kind, had characterized the suspect as a white male in his mid-20s to mid-30s, a profile that was logical based on the existing data about serial killers but that completely failed to account for the possibility that the perpetrator was a juvenile whose physical maturity and aggressive behavior might allow him to pass for an older man in the brief and terrifying encounters that preceded each murder. Russell committed his fourth murder on April 15, 1976, killing a 27-year-old woman named Jeanette Clara in a parking garage in Alexandria, and the investigation was now consuming the entire department and generating intense media coverage that was creating a climate of fear in the city, particularly among women, who were altering their daily routines. Avoiding parking lots, and organizing carpools and escort systems in an effort to reduce their vulnerability to a killer who seemed able to strike at will in locations that were supposed to be safe and ordinary. It was Russell's fifth and final attack, on May 5, 1976, that finally led to his capture, when he attempted to abduct a woman in the parking lot of an apartment complex in Alexandria but was interrupted by the arrival of another resident whose presence startled Russell and caused him to flee on foot, a departure that was witnessed by the intended victim, who provided a detailed description of the suspect to responding officers. The description, which included specific details about Russell's clothing, his physical build, and the direction in which he fled, allowed officers to establish a perimeter and conduct a systematic search of the surrounding area, and Russell was apprehended approximately 30 minutes after the attempted abduction, hiding in a wooded area less than a mile from the scene, still carrying the knife he had intended to use in the attack. When detectives brought Russell in for questioning, they initially had no idea that they were interviewing the serial killer who had been terrorizing the city for 2 months, as the suspect in custody was a boy who appeared to be younger than his actual age and who did not match the adult profile that investigators had been working from. But during the interrogation, Russell, who was exhausted, frightened, and unable to withstand the pressure of the questioning, began to confess, first to the attempted abduction that had led to his arrest, and then, in a cascading series of admissions that stunned the experienced detectives in the room, to all 5 murders, providing details about each crime that had not been released to the public and that could only have been known to the perpetrator. The trial of Monty Russell was complicated by the fact that he was a juvenile at the time of the murders, which meant that under Virginia law, the question of whether he would be tried as an adult or as a juvenile had to be determined by a transfer hearing, a proceeding in which the prosecution presented evidence of the extraordinary severity and premeditation of the crimes and argued that the juvenile system was wholly inadequate to address the level of danger that Russell represented to the community. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing testimony from forensic psychologists who described Russell as a deeply disturbed individual with antisocial personality traits and a high likelihood of reoffending, ordered that Russell be tried as an adult, a decision that was upheld on appeal and that cleared the way for his prosecution on 5 counts of first-degree murder. The trial itself took place in the Circuit Court of Alexandria in 1977, and the prosecution, led by Commonwealth's attorney John Clark, presented a case that was built entirely on Russell's confessions, as the forensic evidence linking him to the individual crime scenes was limited by the investigative techniques available at the time. But the specificity and internal consistency of the confessions, combined with the detailed knowledge they demonstrated of each crime scene, were more than sufficient to convince the jury of Russell's guilt. The defense, led by court-appointed attorneys, attempted to argue that the confessions had been coerced and that Russell's youth and psychological disturbances should be considered as mitigating factors, but the jury rejected these arguments and returned verdicts of guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder after deliberating for approximately 4 hours. The judge sentenced Russell to 5 consecutive life terms in the Virginia Department of Corrections, ensuring that he would never be released from prison, a sentence that Russell has been serving since 1977 in various correctional facilities across the state, including a lengthy period at the super-maximum security Red Onion State Prison in Pound, Virginia, where he remains incarcerated to this day. During his decades in prison, Russell has been studied by numerous criminologists and psychologists, and interviews conducted with him have provided valuable insights into the development of serial violent behavior in adolescence, revealing a young man who expressed no genuine remorse for his crimes and who described his murders in a detached and matter-of-fact tone that suggested a complete absence of empathy for his victims, a characteristic that behavioral scientists have identified as one of the most reliable predictors of long-term dangerousness in incarcerated offenders. For the city of Alexandria, the Monty Russell case was a traumatic awakening that forced a fundamental reassessment of the assumption that suburban communities were inherently immune from the kind of serial violence that Americans associated with large urban centers, and the case led to significant changes in the way the Alexandria Police Department approached sexual assault investigations, including the implementation of more sophisticated patrol strategies in parking areas, improved communication with neighboring jurisdictions, and a greater willingness to consider a broader range of suspect profiles in serial crime investigations. The case also contributed to the broader national conversation about the treatment of juvenile offenders, particularly those who commit violent crimes, and the question of whether the juvenile justice system, with its emphasis on rehabilitation, was adequately equipped to identify and manage young offenders whose behavior indicated a trajectory toward increasingly serious violence. A conversation that continues to this day as the field of juvenile forensic psychology continues to develop more refined tools for assessing risk and designing interventions that might prevent adolescents like Monty Russell from progressing from minor offenses to serial murder. Number 8, Robert Maudsley, a man whose life trajectory moved from a childhood of almost incomprehensible abuse in the industrial city of Liverpool, England, to a permanent existence inside a custom-built glass cage in the depths of Wakefield Prison, where he remains to this day as one of the most closely monitored and securely confined prisoners in the history of the British penal system, having killed 4 people, 3 of them inside prison walls, in a series of murders that revealed a capacity for focused and extreme violence that even the most hardened prison officers found deeply disturbing. Robert John Maudsley was born on June 26, 1953, in the Toxteth district of Liverpool, one of 4 children born to a family that was plagued by severe dysfunction, parental neglect, and physical abuse of a nature and duration that would later be cited by psychiatric professionals as among the most extreme cases of childhood trauma they had encountered in their careers. A fact that is relevant not as an excuse for Maudsley's crimes but as a necessary context for understanding the psychological landscape from which those crimes emerged. Maudsley's early years were characterized by repeated episodes of physical violence inflicted by his parents, and he was eventually removed from the family home by local authorities and placed in a series of foster care institutions and children's homes, where rather than finding the safety and stability that the care system was designed to provide, he was subjected to further abuse, including sexual assault by older residents and staff members, experiences that compounded the damage already inflicted by his biological family and left him with a profoundly distorted understanding of human relationships, trust, and emotional regulation. By the time he reached adolescence, Maudsley was exhibiting severe behavioral problems, including self-harm, aggression toward peers and authority figures, and symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as a personality disorder with narcissistic and antisocial features. But the mental health services available to him in the 1960s and early 1970s were fundamentally inadequate to address the level of disturbance he presented, and he was shuffled between institutions without receiving any sustained or effective therapeutic intervention. Maudsley's first killing occurred in 1974, when he was 21 years old and living in London, where he had drifted after leaving the care system and had begun spending time in the city's underground subculture, a world of flophouses, pubs, and transient relationships that provided no structure or supervision and that allowed his growing rage to ferment without restraint. He picked up a man named John Farrell in a pub in the Soho district of London, a man who, according to Maudsley's later accounts, made sexual advances toward him that triggered a volcanic eruption of anger rooted in the years of sexual abuse he had endured in the children's homes. And Maudsley killed Farrell by stabbing him repeatedly in the head and neck in a frenzied attack that was as much an expression of accumulated psychological trauma as it was a specific response to the immediate situation. When Maudsley was arrested for the murder of John Farrell, he was examined by psychiatrists who determined that he was suffering from a mental illness that rendered him a danger to the public, and rather than being tried in a criminal court and sent to prison, he was ordered to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Berkshire that houses some of the most mentally disordered offenders in the British system, a decision that was intended to provide Maudsley with the intensive psychiatric treatment that the courts believed might address the underlying causes of his violent behavior. It was inside Broadmoor that Maudsley committed the act that would define his criminal legacy and earn him a permanent place in the annals of penal history, when on June 29, 1977, he attacked and killed a fellow patient named David Francis, a convicted child molester who, according to accounts that emerged after the incident, had been displaying photographs of his crimes to other patients and making comments that Maudsley found intolerable, though the precise trigger for the attack has never been definitively established. What is known is that Maudsley lured Francis into his room at Broadmoor, where he attacked him with a homemade weapon, a makeshift knife fashioned from a plastic teaspoon that he had spent weeks sharpening against the concrete walls of his cell until it possessed an edge capable of penetrating human tissue, and he stabbed Francis repeatedly in the head, causing fatal injuries, before calmly walking out of the room and informing staff that he had just killed someone, a statement that was delivered with the same flat and detached effect that characterized all of Maudsley's descriptions of his violent acts. The murder of David Francis, which was particularly shocking to the Broadmoor staff because it demonstrated that Maudsley had been able to manufacture a lethal weapon over an extended period without being detected, led to the decision to transfer him out of the psychiatric system and into the prison system, where it was determined that he should be held in conditions of maximum security that would prevent any possibility of a repeat attack. Maudsley was transferred to Wakefield Prison in West Yorkshire, a facility that housed some of the most dangerous and difficult to manage prisoners in the British system, and it was there, on November 16, 1978, that he committed the double murder that would ultimately lead to his permanent isolation in conditions that have no parallel in the modern British penal system. On that morning, Maudsley was being escorted along a corridor in the prison along with another inmate, a man named Neil Huckle, who was also a convicted child molester, when Maudsley produced a homemade dagger that he had concealed on his person and stabbed Huckle repeatedly in the back and neck, killing him almost instantly. He then entered the cell of a third inmate, a man named Robert Roberts, who was also a convicted sex offender, and attacked him with the same weapon, inflicting fatal stab wounds before prison officers were able to physically subdue Maudsley and remove him from the cell. The speed and ferocity of the double attack, which was completed in a matter of minutes and which left both victims dead from massive trauma, left even experienced prison officers shaken, as it demonstrated a level of focused lethal intent that was extraordinary even by the standards of a maximum security prison where violence was a constant background reality. In the aftermath of the Wakefield murders, the prison authorities faced a dilemma that had no precedent in the British penal system, as Maudsley had now killed 3 people inside secure facilities despite being under constant supervision, proving that the standard methods of confinement and monitoring were insufficient to prevent him from manufacturing weapons and carrying out premeditated attacks. The solution that was eventually devised was the construction of a custom-built isolation unit inside Wakefield Prison, a space that has become known colloquially as the glass cage, consisting of a small cell constructed entirely from bulletproof glass panels that allow round-the-clock visual monitoring of Maudsley by prison staff, with no blind spots and no physical barriers behind which he could conceal himself or manufacture weapons. The cell is furnished with a concrete bed, a concrete table and chair, and a toilet and sink, all made from solid materials that cannot be disassembled or repurposed, and Maudsley is allowed no personal possessions that could be converted into weapons, restriction that extends to books, writing materials, and photographs, all of which have been removed from his cell over the years as security assessments have identified them as potential components of improvised weapons. He is escorted by a minimum of 4 prison officers whenever he is moved from the cell, which occurs for approximately 1 hour per day in a specially designed exercise yard that is also constructed from glass and concrete and that allows Maudsley to walk in the open air while remaining under constant observation from multiple angles. Robert Maudsley has now lived in these conditions for more than 4 decades, a period of isolation that is believed to be the longest continuous period of solitary confinement of any prisoner currently incarcerated in a Western democracy, and his case has become a focal point for debate among human rights organizations, penal reform advocates, and legal scholars who have argued that the conditions of his confinement amount to cruel and unusual punishment that violates his fundamental human rights under both British law and the European Convention on Human Rights. Maudsley himself has, through his legal representatives and through letters that have been published in the media, expressed a desire to be allowed some form of human contact and mental stimulation, requesting access to books, a television, and the opportunity to interact with other human beings, even if only through a glass partition, requests that the prison authorities have consistently denied on the grounds that any relaxation of the security conditions would create an unacceptable risk to the safety of other prisoners and staff. In a series of letters written from his glass cage and published in British newspapers, Maudsley has described his existence as a living death, a state of sensory deprivation and psychological stagnation that he endures every day without any prospect of change, and while his expressions of suffering have generated considerable public sympathy in some quarters, they have been counterbalanced by the awareness that the 3 men he killed inside secure facilities were themselves convicted of some of the most abhorrent crimes imaginable, and that Maudsley's own actions created the conditions in which he now lives. The British prison system has, over the years, periodically reviewed Maudsley's conditions of confinement, and each review has concluded that the current arrangements represent the least restrictive option that is consistent with the safety of others, a determination that reflects the fundamental tension at the heart of the case, which is the impossibility of balancing Maudsley's right to humane treatment against the demonstrable and ongoing risk he poses to anyone who comes within his physical reach. For the families of Maudsley's victims, the case represents a complex and painful legacy, as the knowledge that their loved ones were killed by a man who was already in custody and under state supervision added a layer of betrayal and institutional failure to the already devastating experience of losing a family member to violence, and the subsequent decades of legal proceedings, security reviews, and media coverage have periodically reopened wounds that can never fully heal. The story of Robert Maudsley also serves as a grim case study in the cascading consequences of institutional failure, as the abuse he suffered in the care system as a child, the inadequate mental health treatment he received as an adolescent, and the security lapses that allowed him to kill 3 people inside supposedly secure facilities represent a chain of systemic failures that began before he was born and that culminated in a form of punishment that exists at the very boundary of what any civilized society considers acceptable, a boundary that Maudsley himself has forced the British penal system to confront with an honesty and directness that is deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Number 9, Joseph Edward Duncan III, a diagnosed psychopath and convicted sex offender whose meticulously planned invasion of a family home in the serene lakeside community of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in the spring of 2005 resulted in the murder of 3 people and the abduction and prolonged torture of 2 children. An ordeal so extreme in its cruelty that it remains one of the most horrifying crimes in modern American history and a case that exposed devastating gaps in the systems designed to monitor and contain predatory offenders after their release from prison. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25, 1963, in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the youngest of 3 children born into a military family that moved frequently during his early childhood before settling in the Tacoma, Washington, area, where Duncan spent his formative years in a household that, by his own later accounts and the recollections of family members, was characterized by severe physical abuse, emotional neglect, and an atmosphere of pervasive tension that left a deep and lasting imprint on his psychological development. Duncan's first known violent act occurred when he was a teenager, when in 1978, at the age of 15, he broke into a neighbor's home in Tacoma and assaulted a 14-year-old boy at gunpoint, forcing the boy to perform sexual acts before the victim's mother arrived home and interrupted the attack, a crime for which Duncan was adjudicated delinquent in the juvenile justice system and placed in a residential treatment facility where, according to later evaluations, he displayed no genuine engagement with the therapeutic process and instead learned to mimic the language of remorse and rehabilitation that his evaluators wanted to hear, a skill of deceptive manipulation that would become one of his most dangerous and well-developed capabilities. Despite the clear warning signs presented by this early offense, Duncan was released from juvenile custody after a relatively short period of time and returned to the community, where he quickly resumed the pattern of predatory behavior that the juvenile system had failed to address. And in 1980, at the age of 17, he kidnapped 2 young boys, aged 10 and 11, from a video arcade in Tacoma, drove them to a remote area, sexually assaulted both of them, and then shot them both in the head at point-blank range, killing one boy, whose body was recovered, and leaving the other for dead in a shallow grave from which he miraculously escaped despite suffering a severe gunshot wound to the head. Duncan was arrested and charged with the murder of the boy who died, as well as the attempted murder and sexual assault of the surviving victim, and he eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that, under the laws of the state of Washington at the time, allowed for the possibility of parole after a minimum period of incarceration, a possibility that became a reality in 1994 when a parole board, acting on recommendations from prison psychologists who believed that Duncan had been rehabilitated, granted him release after he had served approximately 14 years of his life sentence, a decision that would have consequences so catastrophic that they are almost impossible to fully comprehend. After his release from prison in 1994, Duncan moved to the Minneapolis, Minnesota, area, where he enrolled in college, earned a degree in computer science, and established himself as a seemingly reformed and productive member of society, holding jobs in the technology industry and maintaining a facade of normalcy that was so convincing that those who knew him during this period described him as quiet, intelligent, and unremarkable, a man who gave no indication of the darkness that lay beneath his carefully constructed surface. Behind this facade, however, Duncan was actively engaging in a pattern of behavior that included the production of child pornography, the stalking of children in his neighborhood, and the cultivation of a secret life that he documented in extensive online journals and writings in which he described his pedophilic impulses in clinical and detached terms, referring to himself as a predator and expressing a sense of inevitability about the fact that he would eventually act on his desires again. Writings that would later be recovered by investigators and that provided a chilling window into the mind of a man who understood his own pathology with perfect clarity and yet felt no compulsion whatsoever to prevent its expression. In 2005, Duncan, who was by this time a registered sex offender in Minnesota after being caught with child pornography, left the state and began driving across the western United States in a stolen vehicle, a journey that had no fixed destination but that was driven by an escalating internal pressure that Duncan later described as a predatory hunger that could no longer be contained, and it was during this journey that he arrived in the Coeur d'Alene area of northern Idaho, a region of extraordinary natural beauty centered on a large lake surrounded by forested mountains, a place that attracted tourists, retirees, and families seeking a quiet and wholesome environment in which to raise their children. The family that Duncan targeted was the Gruen family, who lived in a modest home on a rural road just outside the city limits of Coeur d'Alene, a household consisting of Brenda Gruen, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, and Brenda's 3 children, 13-year-old Slade, 9-year-old Dylan, and 8-year-old Shasta, a family that was, by all accounts, happy, loving, and deeply connected to their community. A family that represented exactly the kind of ordinary, decent, and vulnerable target that a predator like Duncan sought out with the precision and patience of a hunter tracking prey across a landscape. On the evening of May 16, 2005, Duncan broke into the Gruen home, armed with a shotgun and a handgun, and over the course of several hours, he bludgeoned, bound, and stabbed Brenda Gruen, Mark McKenzie, and Slade Gruen to death, methodically eliminating the adults and older children in the household while leaving Dylan and Shasta alive. A calculated decision that reflected Duncan's specific interest in prepubescent children and his intention to abduct them for purposes of sexual exploitation and torture that he had been planning and fantasizing about for years. After completing the murders, Duncan cleaned the crime scene with a thoroughness that indicated extensive premeditation, removing bloodstains and other evidence, and then loaded Dylan and Shasta into his vehicle and drove away from the house, beginning a captivity that would last for approximately 7 weeks and that would take the 2 children to some of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the western United States, including the Lolo National Forest in Montana, where Duncan set up a series of wilderness campsites from which he could hold the children without fear of detection. During the 7 weeks of captivity, Duncan subjected Dylan and Shasta to a regime of sexual abuse, physical torture, and psychological terror that was so extreme in its duration and intensity that the forensic psychologists who later evaluated the case described it as among the most severe cases of child sexual abuse and torture they had ever encountered in their professional careers, involving acts of violence that are too graphic to detail but that included repeated sexual assaults, beatings, electric shock, waterboarding, and the systematic destruction of the children's sense of safety, dignity, and hope. Dylan Gruen did not survive the captivity, as Duncan eventually murdered him at one of the Montana campsites, shooting him in the head and burning his body in a fire pit, a killing that Shasta was forced to witness and that Duncan later described in his writings with a detachment that bordered on the mechanical, as if the extinguishment of a child's life was merely an administrative task to be completed in the course of a larger project. The breakthrough that ended Duncan's reign of terror came on July 2, 2005. When a waitress at a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene named Shasta Gruen sitting in a booth with a man who appeared to be an adult male, and although the child did not cry out or make any obvious gesture of distress, something about the situation triggered the waitress's instincts and prompted her to call the local police to report what she had seen. Officers responded to the restaurant within minutes, and when they approached the booth, they found Joseph Edward Duncan sitting across from Shasta Gruen, who was eating a milkshake and appeared to be in a state of profound psychological dissociation, a condition that child trauma specialists later explained was a survival mechanism that allowed her to function in the presence of her captor by mentally separating herself from the reality of her situation. Duncan was arrested without incident, and when Shasta was safely separated from him and placed in the care of Child Protective Services, she began to provide information to investigators that confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved in the case, identifying Duncan as the man who had killed her family, abducted her and her brother, and subjected them to weeks of torture in the wilderness. The investigation that followed Duncan's arrest was one of the most complex and emotionally grueling ever conducted by the FBI and its partner agencies, involving the coordination of search teams across multiple states, the excavation of the Montana campsites where Dylan Gruen's remains were eventually recovered, and the meticulous forensic analysis of evidence that Duncan had left behind at the Gruen home, in the wilderness camps, and in his vehicle and possessions. During the interrogation that followed his arrest, Duncan initially attempted to maintain the manipulative facade that had served him so well throughout his life, but as investigators presented him with the physical evidence they had recovered and the testimony of Shasta Gruen, his composure began to crack, and he eventually confessed to the murders of Brenda Gruen, Mark Mackenzie, Slade Gruen, and Dylan Gruen, as well as to the abduction and sexual abuse of Shasta, providing detailed accounts of each crime that were consistent with the forensic evidence and that revealed a level of premeditation and planning that was staggering in its scope. The federal government, rather than pursuing prosecution in Idaho State Court, assumed jurisdiction over the case under federal kidnapping and firearms charges, a decision that was driven by the desire to secure a death penalty conviction in a case where the state of Idaho's death penalty statute was considered less robust than the federal system, and the trial of Joseph Edward Duncan III began in Boise, Idaho, in the summer of 2008, before Chief Judge Edward Lodge of the United States District Court for the District of Idaho. The prosecution, led by Assistant United States Attorney Tracy Whalen, presented a case that was built on an overwhelming volume of physical evidence, forensic analysis, Duncan's own confessions, and the testimony of Shasta Gruen, who, despite her young age and the trauma she had endured, took the witness stand and looked directly at the man who had destroyed her family, describing in a voice that was steady despite the enormity of what she was recounting the events of the night her family was killed and the weeks of captivity that followed, a performance that left the courtroom in stunned silence and that was later described by experienced prosecutors as one of the most courageous acts of testimony they had ever witnessed. The defense, led by federal public defenders, did not contest Duncan's guilt but instead argued during the penalty phase that his traumatic childhood, his brain abnormalities as revealed by neurological imaging, and his diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic features should be considered as mitigating factors that warranted a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death, arguments that the jury rejected after deliberating for less than a day, returning a verdict of death on all three counts for which the prosecution had sought capital punishment. Judge Lodge formally sentenced Duncan to death on August 20, 2008, and Duncan was transferred to the federal death row facility at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he remained for the rest of his life, pursuing a series of appeals that were uniformly unsuccessful and that were characterized by a level of self-representation and legal argumentation that demonstrated his high intelligence and his ability to manipulate the legal system even from a position of total confinement. Joseph Edward Duncan III died on March 28, 2021, at the age of 58, from complications of brain cancer while still on federal death row, an ending that was widely regarded as far more merciful than anything he had extended to any of his victims. And his death closed a chapter on one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history without ever providing a satisfactory answer to the question of how a man who had been identified as a dangerous predator at the age of 15 was able to pass through multiple layers of the criminal justice system and emerge on the other side with the freedom to commit atrocities of a magnitude that defied comprehension. For the community of Coeur d'Alene, the Duncan case was a seismic event that shattered the illusion of safety that the natural beauty and small-town character of the region had always provided, forcing residents to confront the reality that no community, no matter how isolated or picturesque, is immune from the predations of individuals who are driven by compulsions that no landscape can contain and no lock can deter. And the case prompted significant changes in the way sex offenders are monitored after release from prison, with particular attention paid to the use of GPS tracking technology and the coordination of information between jurisdictions, reforms that were directly inspired by the failure of the system to prevent Duncan from traveling from Minnesota to Idaho and carrying out the crimes that defined his legacy. Number 10, Herb Baumeister, a successful businessman, husband, and father who lived in a spacious suburban home on a 10-acre estate in the quiet community of Westfield, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis, and who used the privacy afforded by his wealth and social standing to bury the remains of at least 11 men in the wooded grounds of his own property, a horror that unfolded gradually over several years before being discovered in a manner that exposed the devastating limitations of law enforcement's ability to connect the disappearances of marginalized individuals whose absences from society went largely unnoticed by the institutions designed to protect them. Herbert Richard Baumeister was born on April 7, 1947, in Indianapolis, Indiana, the eldest of 4 children born into a middle-class family with no history of criminal behavior or notable dysfunction, and his early life, in sharp contrast to many of the other perpetrators examined in this compilation, presented no obvious indicators of the profound pathology that would later emerge, as he was described by childhood acquaintances, teachers, and neighbors as a quiet, intelligent, and somewhat socially awkward young man who showed an early aptitude for business and entrepreneurship, traits that he would eventually parlay into a level of financial success that provided him with the means and the privacy to pursue his darkest impulses without external interference. Baumeister attended Indiana University but did not complete his degree, dropping out in the late 1960s to pursue various business ventures that eventually led him to found a chain of thrift stores called the Save-A-Lot stores, which grew to include multiple locations across the Indianapolis metropolitan area and generated a substantial income that allowed Baumeister to purchase a large home on Fox Hollow Farm, a 10-acre estate in the affluent Westfield community that featured a main house, a swimming pool, outbuildings, and several acres of densely wooded land that provided a level of seclusion that would prove critical to the concealment of his crimes. In 1971, Baumeister married a woman named Juliana Spires, with whom he eventually had 3 children, and the Baumeister family presented to the outside world a picture of suburban respectability and normalcy that was so convincing that it became the foundation of Baumeister's ability to operate undetected for years, as his neighbors in Westfield knew him as a successful but somewhat reclusive businessman who attended his children's school events, maintained his property, and generally kept to himself, a profile that in no way suggested the capacity for the kind of systematic murder and burial of human beings that was taking place on his property. Beneath this surface, however, Baumeister was harboring a secret life that was centered on a compulsive attraction to men and a pattern of behavior that combined elements of pathological lying, sexual deviance, and homicidal violence in a configuration that forensic psychologists would later describe as consistent with a sexually motivated serial killer who derived satisfaction from the complete possession and destruction of his victims. Baumeister's homosexual activities, which he kept entirely hidden from his wife, his children, and his social circle in the conservative Indianapolis suburbs of the 1980s and 90s, involved frequenting gay bars in the Indianapolis area, particularly a bar called the 501 Eagle, where he would approach young men, typically in their 20s, who were often marginalized by society in various ways, including being homeless, struggling with substance abuse, or otherwise existing in circumstances that made them less likely to be reported missing or actively searched for by family members or authorities. The disappearances that would later be linked to Baumeister began in the early 1990s, with at least 11 young men vanishing from the Indianapolis area between approximately 1990 and 1996, a pattern that, in isolation, did not immediately trigger alarm among law enforcement agencies because the men who were disappearing were not connected to each other through obvious social or geographic ties, and because the institutional response to the disappearance of a young gay man with a history of substance abuse or transient living arrangements was, at that time, significantly less vigorous than the response to the disappearance of a person who was integrated into mainstream social structures. Over the course of several years, the mothers and family members of several of the missing men had been independently contacting the Indianapolis Police Department and the Marion County Sheriff's Department to report their loved ones as missing, and a small number of detectives had begun to notice that there might be a pattern connecting some of the disappearances, but the investigation was hampered by a lack of resources, a lack of forensic evidence linking the cases, and a cultural climate in which the disappearances of gay men were not treated with the same urgency as the disappearances of other individuals, a systemic bias that would later be identified as one of the most significant failures in the Baumeister case. The breakthrough that finally connected the disappearances to Herb Baumeister came through a remarkably circuitous and unlikely chain of events, beginning with a man named Tony Harris, who was not a law enforcement officer or a criminal investigator but simply a citizen who had noticed that his partner, a young man named Roger Goodlett, had gone missing after spending time at the 501 Eagle Bar, and who had subsequently begun paying close attention to the comings and goings at the bar in an effort to understand what had happened to his partner. Harris, through his surveillance of the bar, observed a man whom he came to know only as Brian, a middle-aged man who drove a distinctive vehicle and who seemed to be targeting young men at the bar with a frequency and a pattern that Harris found suspicious, and he eventually obtained Brian's license plate number and passed it along to a private investigator named Virgil Vandagriff, who traced the plate to a vehicle registered to Herb Baumeister at the Fox Hollow Farm address in Westfield. Van Dagriff, recognizing the potential significance of the information, contacted the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction over Westfield, and provided them with the license plate information and the details of Harris's observations. A tip that landed on the desk of investigators who were already aware of the pattern of disappearances in the Indianapolis area but who had not previously had any specific suspect or location to focus their investigation on. The Hamilton County Sheriff's Department approached Baumeister in the fall of 1995 and requested permission to search his property, a request that Baumeister initially granted before withdrawing his consent when the scope of the proposed search became clear, forcing the Sheriff's Department to obtain a search warrant, a process that was complicated by the fact that they did not yet have enough specific evidence linking Baumeister to any particular crime to satisfy the probable cause requirements of a warrant application. The legal standoff between Baumeister and the Sheriff's Department continued for several months, during which time investigators explored alternative avenues for obtaining access to the property, and it was not until the summer of 1996 that Juliana Baumeister, Erb's wife, who by this point had become aware of certain disturbing elements of her husband's behavior, including the discovery of male pornography hidden in the house and items belonging to young men that she could not account for, filed for divorce and granted the Sheriff's Department permission to search the property without Erb's consent, a decision that was legally permissible because she held a co-ownership interest in the estate. The search of Fox Hollow Farm began on July 2, 1996, and almost immediately, investigators discovered human remains buried in the wooded areas of the property, as teams of forensic archaeologists and cadaver dogs systematically excavated the grounds and uncovered the skeletal remains of what would eventually be determined to be at least 11 individuals, all male, all in their 20s, and all bearing evidence of having been killed by blunt force trauma or strangulation. With some of the remains showing signs of having been dismembered before burial, a detail that suggested a level of effort devoted to concealing the bodies that was consistent with the premeditated and organized nature of the crimes. The condition of the remains, which had been buried for varying periods of time ranging from several months to several years in the acidic soil of the Indiana woodland, made positive identification extremely difficult, and it took forensic anthropologists and DNA analysts months and in some cases years to establish definitive identifications for the recovered remains, with the eventual identification of victims including Alan Labby, Roger Goodlett, Michael Bauer, Richard Hamilton, and several others whose names had been on the missing persons lists that various law enforcement agencies had been maintaining without coordination. While the search of the Fox Hollow Farm property was still underway, Herb Baumeister, who had been informed that the search was taking place and who clearly understood the implications of what was being found, fled Indiana, driving south in his vehicle and eventually crossing the border into Canada, where he checked into a motel in the town of Grand Marais, Ontario, on the shores of Lake Superior. A remote location that he apparently selected because it offered isolation and a final refuge from the consequences that were closing in on him with irresistible force. On July 3, 1996, just one day after the search of his property began, Herb Baumeister was found dead in his motel room in Grand Marais, having died by suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, a death that was discovered by motel staff who had become concerned about a guest who had not checked out at the expected time, and that brought to an abrupt end any possibility of a criminal trial that might have provided answers to the countless questions that the case had generated. The suicide of Herb Baumeister was, from a law enforcement perspective, deeply frustrating, as it denied investigators the opportunity to interrogate the only person who could have provided definitive answers about the full scope of his crimes, the identities of all of his victims, the methods he used to lure and kill them, and the psychological motivations that drove a man who appeared to have everything, including financial success, a family, and social standing, to systematically murder and bury young men in his own backyard. In the years following the discovery of the remains at Fox Hollow Farm, forensic scientists and investigators continued to work on identifying the victims, and additional identifications were made as DNA technology improved and as family members of missing men came forward to provide reference samples for comparison. But several sets of remains recovered from the property have never been positively identified, a fact that suggests that the true number of Baumeister's victims may never be known. and that the 11 individuals definitively linked to the Fox Hollow Farm property may represent only a portion of his actual body count, a suspicion that is reinforced by the fact that Baumeister lived and traveled in other areas of the country, including Ohio, where investigators have explored possible connections between Baumeister and unsolved murders and disappearances in the Columbus and Dayton areas. The Herb Baumeister case sent shockwaves through the Indianapolis metropolitan area and the broader true crime community that were distinct from the reactions generated by other cases in this compilation, because Baumeister did not fit any of the conventional profiles that people typically associate with serial killers, as he was not a drifter, a misfit, or a visibly disturbed individual, but rather a successful businessman who lived in an expensive home in an affluent suburb, attended church, raised children, and participated in the ordinary rituals of suburban life, a fact that forced a profound and uncomfortable reckoning with the reality that the capacity for extreme evil is not confined to any particular social class, educational background, or demographic category, and that the most dangerous predators may be the ones who are best able to camouflage themselves within the structures of normal society. For the families of the victims, the aftermath of the case was a protracted and agonizing ordeal that was compounded by the fact that Baumeister's suicide denied them the closure of a trial and a conviction, leaving them to grapple with unanswered questions about the final hours and moments of their loved ones' lives, questions that no amount of forensic analysis or psychological speculation could ever fully resolve. The case also prompted significant changes in the way law enforcement agencies in Indiana and elsewhere approached missing persons cases involving marginalized populations, leading to the development of better systems for tracking and correlating disappearances, improved protocols for investigating reports of missing adults, and a greater sensitivity to the biases that had historically caused the disappearances of gay men, sex workers, and other marginalized individuals to be treated with less urgency than the disappearances of people who occupied more privileged positions in the social hierarchy. The Fox Hollow Farm property itself, after being thoroughly searched and released by law enforcement, was eventually sold to new owners, and the house and grounds became the subject of considerable public interest and media attention, with reports of paranormal activity and residual energy that, whether or not they have any basis in objective reality, reflected the deep and lasting impact that the discovery of 11 burial sites in a suburban backyard had on the collective psyche of a community that had been forced to confront the fact that the ground beneath their feet had been used as a graveyard by a neighbor they thought they knew.